Hello, everybody. I've got a super long episode. Well, it's probably not super long, but I've got an episode for you exclusively about Theodosia Burr Sr. and Jr. And then, yeah, that's it. That's all the episode about. It's just me this time. It's just me telling stories.
I'm still here.
Actually, still here. You're still here to react, but yeah, just Theodosia Burr. Oh my goodness, so much more than I kind of anticipated. I knew that there was going to be one big story about Theodosia Jr., but like there's so much about these women, and it was good to research them. So let's start with our fun fact, because I did find a fun fact for this. So our fun fact for this one is that Theodosia Sr., like Theodosia Burr as in Aaron Burr's wife, was born around 26 years after Anne Bonny's mysterious disappearance.
Oh.
Yeah, like it was like that, like close in time. And I don't think they have any like connection whatsoever, but I just wanted to bring up Anne Bonny, and I like contextualizing history by looking at how different stories line up on the timeline. So yeah, I just thought that it was interesting that they're like so close.
Well, isn't there a bit of like a pirate tale to this anyways? So there is a bit of a connection.
There's a bit of a connection, but I mean, I don't think that there's a connection in that I don't think Anne Bonny would have still been around and pirating around the time that the pirate tale comes in. So I don't think there's a connection there. Although how fascinating would that be if I was wrong? But there's like no evidence for that because we have no idea what happened to her. So, but we will talk about pirate tales in this one, and I'm excited for that. But first, Ashley, what do you know about Theodosia Burr, older or younger?
I just know that they are in songs in Hamilton.
There's
And
Theodosia, Dear Theodosia, the Lullaby is an absolutely gorgeous song, and I love it.
yeah, and that Theodosia Sr. was cheating on her British husband with Aaron Burr because of Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
And then just that there's pirates because you've talked about the fact that there's pirates.
Because I can't shut up about the pirates.
Exactly. That's all I know.
Yes. So pretty good starting point. Hit some of the main topics. I'm going to go into detail on a bunch of this. So to start off, we're going to talk about Theodosia, the mother, Theodosia Bartow Prevost? We'll assume it's Prevost, who married Aaron Burr and became Theodosia Bartow Burr, or Theodosia Prevost Burr. It bounces between. She's got like 3 last names. One of them is her maiden name, that's Bartow. Prevost is her British husband's married name, and then Burr is obviously when she married Aaron Burr. So she's got multiple last names, and it gets confusing at the sources, but you know. So Theodosia, the daughter, was named after Theodosia, the mother, obviously. So for simplicity's sake, we're just going to refer to them as Theodosia Sr. for the mother and Theodosia Jr. for the daughter.
Makes sense.
So, full source disclaimer, while I did find some primary sources about Theodosia Sr., they didn't provide a lot of information about her life. Most only reference her enough to mention that she married Aaron Burr and that she was married to the British general. That's kind of it. One of them that I found was written by her, but it was an invitation to George Washington, which was just too short of a snapshot of her life to base much on. The wiki for Theodosia Sr. was a little more helpful, but I usually do my best not to use as a main source, but rather a guide as to what to dig into. But in this case, my only sources, or the only sources that the wiki listed were books that I wasn't going to be able to get my hands on in time for this episode, and there weren't many reputable sources outside of that. So I'm going to give a brief overview of Theodosia Sr. because I think it's interesting, but bear in mind my source for this information is her Wikipedia page and only one other article from the St. Louis Mercantile Library. If you're interested in looking further into her, the books listed as sources on that article and the wiki are The Heartbreak of Aaron Burr by H.W. Brands, Fallen Founder, The Life of Aaron Burr, which I did find a couple quotes from for Theodosia Jr. later, by Nancy Eisenberg, and Aaron Burr, The Years from Princeton to Vice President by Milton Lamask. I was eventually able to access parts of Fallen Founder, but not the whole work. If anyone's in the area, the New York Public Library has a box of Aaron Burr letters and documents, including a letter from Theodosia Sr. However, those materials aren't available digitally, and unfortunately, I am not wealthy enough for a spontaneous flight to New York to read them in person.
If we were, then I'd be over New York constantly looking at documents.
Constantly. So, disclaimer out of the way, here is Theodosia's story as far as I can determine. Theodosia Sr. was born in 1746, only weeks after her father's death. Her mother raised her as a single mother for 5 years before remarrying a captain in the British Army. Her stepfather made sure she was well educated and she was fluent in French, later working as a translator in French political treaties. Yeah. She had stepbrothers and sisters as well, and her stepfather passed away in 1762, only a year before Theodosia Sr. married her first husband, Jacques or James Prevost, who is also a British Army officer.
I was gonna say, like, that family seems to like their British men.
Seriously. His name switches between French and English versions in the sources as well. So if it's confusing, that's why. She and her husband had 5 children together before Prevost was dispatched to the West Indies. So her stepfather, who was the only father that she knew, was a captain on the British side. Her husband was on the British side. So where do you think her politics lay on the issue of the revolution?
British?
She was actually on the American side.
Okay, so she went with her mother's side of the
Yeah, she was on the Patriots side.
Well, I mean, I guess so because she was cheating with Burr, so
yeah,
that probably makes more sense.
So she's got all these people in her life, like, that are all on the British side. Her whole her whole husband's side of the family is like all British officers and British soldiers, and then she's just like Patriots. So she was like a well-educated woman, especially for her time. She was definitely making her own decisions, and she was not just going to follow the opinions of the men in her life, and I respect her for that. So while her husband was gone, Theodosia Sr. starts offering her home as a meeting ground for revolutionary leaders. As I mentioned earlier, she wrote a letter to George Washington personally inviting him into her home when she found out that he was going to be in the area, which he accepted, and he used her home, which was called the Hermitage, as his headquarters while he was there.
Okay.
She became known for her home's French culture, which was a result of her French tutoring as a child, as well as her intellect. Many notable people came to stay in her home that her husband likely would not appreciate. At one point, her house was apparently at risk of being confiscated because it was owned by her husband, who was a British officer. But the guests that she often had over were clearly beneficial to her because some of her powerful guests stepped in and prevented the case from going through.
Okay, that's lucky for her.
She was smart. She made friends in high places.
She reminds me a lot of like Angelica in a way, where it's like, hey, let me make sure that I get in touch with all these like high politician men, like political men that are going to help me with getting, like, I don't know, my home to stay.
Exactly. Making sure that she doesn't get kicked out for being affiliated with the British.
Yeah.
So she got to keep her house because she made the right friends. One other notable story came from that period. So the story goes that Theodosia was hosting a number of guests, as she often did, and one of whom was being a bit rude and had insulted her, seemingly without being aware of it. She chose violence and on the spot wrote a poem insulting him and passed it around the room, which had everyone laughing.
That's one way of, like, passing notes along.
So apparently it was, I guess, a French culture thing at the time. One of my sources mentioned that it was like a game that like the intellectuals of France would play, where they just like come up with poetry on the spot, not usually mocking, but in this case she chose violence, and so she had everybody laughing at him through a poem that she wrote on the spot, which is wild.
So she's kind of like a roaster of the time.
Yeah, girl is a savage. Some historians theorize that this story is an anecdote from Aaron Burr as well, so he may have been present for this, and if it was him, he was impressed by it. But we'll get into that in a minute.
But he kept telling Alexander to keep his mouth shut, but his wife is okay to be, like, roasting people through poetry.
Aaron Burr's an interesting guy. But she had this, like, charisma about her that, like, she could do no wrong. So she made friends, for example, with both the American military as well as the British, and practiced espionage in the form of small talk, retrieving secrets from the British and passing it on to the Americans. Like, she was so charismatic that people would just like talk with her and believe her, and she like made friends with everybody. She had as many British officers swooning over her as she did American officers. She had like all of these men like kind of saw her as like a damsel in distress waiting for her husband to return from the war. And she had them all right in the palm of her hand, keeping her home safe and a sanctuary in the war. It was like a no neutral ground, essentially. And no matter what happened, like she was protected from either side. Like it was like she like big brain energy. Like this girl was like
She was
she knew what she
smart,
was doing.
and she knew how to take things to her advantage, which I'm like, good on you, kid.
Yeah, right. So whether she was protecting her loyalist brother or actively aiding the rebellion, she was charismatic, she was clever, and she was maybe a little conniving, but girl knew damn well what she was doing the whole way through.
Well, that's a good thing.
I totally agree. And it tells you a little bit of like where her daughter, Theodosia Jr., gets her wit from. So she met Aaron Burr in the late 1770s. They hit it off pretty quickly, with Aaron falling for her shortly after meeting her, absolutely gushing about her to his sister in a letter, which I again couldn't track down, but I did find a letter from Theodosia to Aaron's sister in the process, which happened to be about a china set. So clearly they got along well.
Mm-hmm.
It was like she had said that her sister had found, or she had found a china set, or her sister had found a china set, and they were talking about passing it back and forth essentially. And she was like saying things like, oh, we need to like get together soon, and I miss you, and I want to see you. So like clearly she got along with his family.
Yeah.
And he was very much not immune to her charms.
Well, no.
Because this guy, like, totally smitten by her. Unlike all the other officers falling all over her, she fell for him as well, and they were openly lovers by 1780. She was, interestingly enough, 10 years older than Aaron, which was uncommon at the time. But her reputation as an intellectual woman didn't come from nowhere, and a lot of their conversations centered around politics, going so far as to go from being general political talk to Aaron Burr realizing that she would be a phenomenal political ally for her understanding of British and American perspectives and ability to make friends with seemingly anyone without being deceived by who they presented themselves to be.
Like, good on her. Like, she made herself valuable, like, in general to both, basically, sides of the war effort.
She was just extremely likable. Like, she was very, like, socially intelligent.
Yeah.
And also intellectually and, like, politically, she knew her stuff as well, which helped her a lot in being socially intelligent with a bunch of political leaders. In 1781, remember I said in 1780 she and Burr were openly lovers. In 1781, she learned that her husband died from yellow fever. And
Convenient.
she married conveniently, although he was literally in another country. Like he was still dispatched. Like he was not home when he passed away. So when he left, she would not see him again. So he passed away in 1781, and she had already kind of been openly in a relationship with Burr at that point, which is where the reference to like her cheating on her British officer with Aaron in Hamilton kind of comes in.
Yeah.
But that only went on for like a year, and then he dies, and then she married Aaron 7 months later in 1782. So clearly she was eager to move on. She had no...
I'm guessing there was no like waiting period as to like, here's how long you need to be in mourning before you can remarry during this time.
I don't know if socially there was. I didn't see anything in my sources saying that there was like an obligatory waiting period or anything. It just 7 months later, like happened to cross over into the new year, and they were married. So she did not want to wait around. So yeah.
Well, it's good because we all know Aaron Burr would have happily been patiently waiting until he couldn't have his chance.
So she encouraged Aaron, after they got married, to continue studying law in order for him to maintain respect and independence, and at the same time made it clear that she would be maintaining her own independence as well. She didn't want either to be dependent on each other because she believed they would become resentful if they were dependent on each other and they would fall out of love. I kind of don't disagree. She refused to exist as a side note to his career, and I madly respect her for that, especially at that time when that was so against the status quo.
Yeah.
But she's also kind of playing the game here because she knows that between the two of them, like, she can be charming and charismatic as much as she wants. She can't get, like, a political job or, like, a well-paying, like, job as a lawyer or anything. So she has him working his way up the ladder to make the money to support her and her 5 children.
Yeah.
So, like, it's like a smart move from, like, so many different angles. So here's where Aaron adopted Theodosia's 5 children. And the couple had their first child together later the same year after they got married, who was Theodosia Jr. They had a few others later, but unfortunately, Theodosia Jr. was the only one to survive to adulthood, which was much more common back then, but it's still tragic. So Theodosia Sr. educated their daughter in the same way any wealthy boy would have been educated at the time, being a strong feminist herself, until her health started to deteriorate. Why is that such a hard word?
Because it's a long one.
True. And Aaron had to take over more and more. Theodosia Sr. had been sick for a long time, though it's unclear how long, but in 1792 it became a regular pain, and 2 years later she passed away, theoretically from stomach or uterine cancer.
Ooh, yeah. That does not sound like a fun way to go. Like, no.
And without being able to diagnose it for what it was at the time, they just knew it was stomach pains. They didn't know what caused it, and they couldn't possibly have known how to treat it. So Aaron Burr is quoted as later saying that she was, quote, the best woman and finest lady I have ever known, end quote. And even praised her, saying he hadn't seen much evidence for, quote, female intellectual powers, unquote, except in her, that it was knowledge of her mind that impressed him with respect for that of her sex. They had been married for 10 years, and he only remarried decades later in 1833.
Yep, makes about sense for, like, knowing how he, like, how in-depth he was about things.
But all of that is sweet, all of that is adorable. I'm about to ruin it. So, before he remarried, there was the life and death of his daughter, Theodosia Jr., and I would like to note here that she was not his only daughter, even biologically at this point, only possibly his favorite. Besides his stepchildren, there were also 2 children that Burr fathered that he didn't openly acknowledge, and it's unknown if his first wife even knew about them, though they were born only a few years after Burr married Theodosia.
Okay, so who else was he sleeping around with?
So, the second of the 2 being fathered while she was dying of cancer.
No, Burr, no.
Because no one in history can keep it in their pants.
Apparently not.
So, it sounds like this sweet, adorable love story. He is romantically invested in her. While he was married to her, while she was dying, he was cheating on her with one of the servants in his household.
Of course. Of course it would be like somebody from the freaking household.
So, they're the children of one of his servants, who was a black woman named Mary Emmons, also known as Eugenie. And those kids went on to do amazing things. There was Louisa Burr, again, briefly, as according to Wikipedia, who worked as a servant for some prominent people for a good portion of her life before marrying Francis Webb, who was a founding member of the Pennsylvania Augustine Education Society, secretary of the Haitian Immigration Society, and distributor of the Freedom's Journal, which was the first African-American owned and operated newspaper in the States.
Oh, so she had a cool life.
So she had a cool life. She knew some cool people, and she put herself in positions to meet cool people. So that's an interesting story. And the second child was John Pierre Burr, who became a member of the Underground Railroad, directly helping refugees escape in Philadelphia. He was an agent for the abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, as well as the chairman of the American Moral Reform Society.
Not bad.
So he went on to do some really cool shit.
Yeah. Like, they're, like, technically illegitimate children, but they went on to be like, fuck that.
Yeah,
we can
seriously.
do whatever we want, and we're going to do some cool stuff that's going to, like, rewrite history more than our father ever really did.
Right. And honestly, both could probably be their own episode, or maybe the 2 of them together. I don't know how many sources we're going to find on them. So I don't want to go too much further into them here. I don't want to tell their whole story as a footnote. I just wanted to point out that they exist and they are worth reading up on.
Yeah, definitely.
One of the stories, for example, of John Pierre Burr, when he was when he was like working as a member of the Underground Railroad, because he was mixed race, he was very pale. Like he was very light-skinned. He was like kind of white passing. So what he would do is he would take slaves that were trying to escape to freedom, and he would pass them off as his slaves, get to the next checkpoint, and then just like let them make sure that they got to safety, and then leave them in the hands of the next checkpoint. And he would do this all the time, just like pretending to be like a white man, so that if anybody questioned him, he would just be like, "Oh no, these they're with me. It's all good. We're good here." And then they would just like believe him and walk on by.
So he had brains. Good to know. Like,
So,
he got
so
like
he's
the
smart.
brain cells
So
of the
he's
family.
Yeah, so he's smart and he's convincing and he's like, yeah, he seemed like a really, yeah, they both seemed like really like interesting people that were like very much like involved in the movement and everything. And I would like to do more research on them later. So I'm like thinking maybe we can do an episode on them at some point. So, and this leads us back to Theodosia Jr. because again, I don't want to tell their whole story here. I want to dig into that at another point. And so Theodosia Jr. really is the jewel of this piece, which I say because, I mean, well, I love a good mystery, and this one involves pirates, and we all know by now how I love a good pirate story. And I found a better handful of sources for Theodosia Jr. than I did for Theodosia Sr., including a presentation on YouTube by the North Carolina Museum of History, which was quite interesting, and I recommend listening to it if you ever get the chance. So, Theodosia Burr was the only child of Aaron Burr and Theodosia Burr Sr. to survive to adulthood. Both of her parents were surprisingly progressive feminists for the time, and she was given an extensive education studying the usual subjects as well as math, Latin, Greek, French, and English, and could read and write by age 3.
Okay, she's a brilliant child.
She is a brilliant child. This girl is a prodigy. So she was reading books well above her reading level and was doted on by her father by all accounts. She seemed to be close with her 5 step-siblings as well, later writing with great affection to the wife of one of her stepbrothers, basically acting as sisters, which is adorable to see.
Mm-hmm.
And she was such a daddy's girl and was her father's pride and joy. Theodosia Sr. wrote to her father while he was traveling to say that she was left miserable at the mention of his name while he was gone and that her, quote, attachment was not of a common nature. She was writing letters to him by age 5 and keeping a journal at his instruction. His responses to her letters included editorial criticisms of her writing, pointing out grammar and spelling mistakes, as well as encouragement.
So always a teacher.
Always a teacher, because that was part of her curriculum. That was a teaching style that he had learned from some other philosopher I don't remember the name of, and started practicing with his own kid. So, like I mentioned earlier, both mother and father played a massive part in providing her education. So when Theodosia Sr. passed away, Theodosia Jr. was only 10. She would have lost 2 brothers who were stillborn and a younger sister who died at age 3. So she had more than her share of grief at a very young age.
Yeah, like, that's sad for her. Like, that she would have had to go through all of that.
It's a lot. It's a lot for a little 10-year-old. Her father continued overseeing her education from afar while he worked for the Senate, encouraging a French governess to open a school from his home to continue her studies, as well as inviting her young charge, Natalie Delage, only 8 months older than Theodosia Jr., to join as a friend for Theodosia, as well as an example of class and sophistication. So luckily they got along and became lifelong friends. Her parents' educational methods, combined with her natural intellect, resulted in a child prodigy who grew up to become one of the most educated women of her time. Her father had big ambitions for her, and he treated her education as an experiment, essentially testing if women could be as intellectual as men if given the same education and opportunity. He desperately wanted her to grow up to convince the world that, quote, what neither sex appears to believe, that women have souls, which is a lofty task for a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
Or even more so for a baby.
Like, that's a huge task, because at that point, men really didn't want to believe that.
No, they didn't. Women weren't counted as humans in the eyes of the law.
And really, did her father actually believe it? Because he was the one just sleeping around with everyone.
Like I said, nobody in history can keep it in their pants, but he was surprisingly feminist. So, like, and again, we don't know if Theodosia knew that he had, like, a mistress, that there was another woman in his life.
I mean, if it was in the same house, like, if it was in the same household, you'd think he'd realize it.
I mean, maybe, but, you know, we don't know. We don't have any documentation saying that she knew.
Yeah,
or
well,
that
she might have, like, hidden the fact that she knew, right? Where it's like, okay, I know, but I'm not going to say anything because that is my job as your wife, is to just let you do whatever the heck you want to do.
Or maybe she, like, didn't, like, maybe she wasn't bothered by it.
Yeah.
That's a possibility, too. But we have no way of knowing, though. So, yeah, it turns out he was a massive feminist, and he put a lot of pressure on his daughter to show up and prove everybody wrong, essentially, but in, like, the biggest way. And she did. She grew up to be renowned for her mind as much as her mother was, for her charm. Her education was intense, like 3 hours of writing practice starting at 5 a.m. every morning and 3 more at night intense.
Like 5 a.m.? Jesus.
5 a.m.
The kid can't be brilliant if the kid doesn't get any sleep.
Every hour was dedicated to her curriculum. Like, everything was mapped out. Like, there was so much control in her education. And Burr believed in keeping his children busy and disciplined, believing that it would make them successful.
Well, no wonder she decided to turn to piracy later on. She needed some fun.
Actually, she's not the pirate in that story, but we'll get to it later. I know, right? Okay, so we'll get to that later. So that would have been an amazing story. As far as we know, I should say, she's not the pirate in that story. I have a whole new theory about what happened to her there now. Distracted. Anyway, so it was crazy, crazy disciplined. And even still, like, every hour was mapped out. Like, there was, like, for 3 hours she studies this, or she studies writing in the morning, and then for 3 hours she practices math, and then she does some physical activity, and then, like, all of it was mapped out, kind of like school now, but, like, her entire day. But even still, she adored her father so much, so she must have enjoyed them to, like, at least an extent. Either that, or she was just desperate to please him and went along with it just to make him happy. So it's possible that her father saw raising her into an intellectual as sort of a tribute to her mother as well, because he held very high esteem for her mind too, right?
Yeah.
And it's possible that Theodosia Jr. saw it the same way. So at 15, she was described as being able to dance as gracefully as any young New York woman, but at the same time being able to hold conversations about classical writers and being well-versed in multiple languages. Already, she was learning to toe the line of societal expectation and offense. She was surpassing expectations about what she could do as a woman, but without doing it in a way that would bring her criticism for breaking those barriers as a woman, which makes me think of Peggy Schuyler, who did not toe that line so well, and went heavy on the intelligent side to the point of people telling her that she needed to dial it back. So it's like she really was being trained in how to kind of have the best of both worlds and to, like, excel at everything she did. But no pressure for a 15-year-old at this point.
Yeah, no pressure. Not one little bit.
But she was doing it. She was surpassing expectations. Like I said, she had to meet the definition of a perfect woman as well as the definition of a perfect man without allowing anyone to question her femininity. And she was achieving that, which is like seriously, prodigy child. Like,
yeah, well, I mean, I guess she wouldn't have known anything different if she was, like, basically, like, homeschooled, I guess, in a way, from, like, what you're saying, other than, like, her little friend and stuff, right? Like, that she wouldn't have been like, oh, but everybody else doesn't have to do this.
Mm-hmm. No, her whole life was like this, right? Like, she never would have known anything else. So her father was aware of this as well and made it painfully clear to her the pressure that she was under to, as Shakespeare would say, take pains and be perfect. He was desperate for her to be an example of what women could be. He was a determined feminist, but in the name of the movement, crushed his daughter's freedom in order to force her into this position of being a role model for all women, essentially from birth. I can't imagine how she must have felt under that pressure, but she was extremely strong and carried it all, apparently almost effortlessly.
And I'm not surprised.
So, I was kind of surprised to hear that Burr was this much of a feminist, because again, like in like Hamilton, there's like very little reference of that from Burr about him taking a stand on anything.
Yeah.
So that he has such a strong stand on this was kind of surprising to me to learn.
I mean, unless he was, like, finally taking a page out of Alexander's book.
Which is possible. Though, at this point, I'm trying to think about how this maps up timeline-wise with whether or not... I think he would know Alexander at this point. But I don't think... Yeah, no, at this point, he definitely knew Alexander.
Yeah, because Theodosia Sr., they... Like, her husband died around the same time as when Alexander and, like, Eliza met.
Mm.
Or no.
So, yeah.
Yeah, like they were meeting or something, like, around that same time. Because it was the fall of 1780 that Alexander and Eliza met. It was Alexander's wedding. that he found out that Burr had a woman from a British officer.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, definitely knew each other. So that's Theodosia's childhood, that's her teen years, that's her upbringing. So now, as a young woman, Theodosia took over her father's household as the hostess, but he did not and would not let her be limited to a station society had set out for her, and insisted that even into adulthood she shouldn't abandon her studies. Nonetheless, like her mother, she knew how to play the game society set out for her, and she followed in her mother's footsteps, making friends with even her father's political enemies. So even the people that didn't like Aaron Burr still said that, okay, but his daughter is a genius, though. And, like, had nothing but good things to say about her.
Well, I mean, keep your enemies closer.
Yeah, so she played the part that she was, like, kind of supposed to play, since she would never be allowed into politics or to practice law, no matter what her reputation was. Her father recognized the political benefits of marrying Theodosia to a wealthy young man, and he chose a man named Joseph Alston. She had to be convinced into the marriage a little, from what we can see, at one point replying to one of Alston's proposals, saying that Aristotle advised that no man should marry before 30. He was young, he was 22. So
Okay.
she basically said that, like, well, you shouldn't be getting married until 30 anyway, so, like,
Let's
why
wait.
bother? So he essentially replied, asking if it was fair to make a man wait until 30 if he was desperately in love with a young woman and was only 22. She must have thought that was a good point. So in 1801, at 18, she was 18, he was, I think, around 22 still, she married him. They honeymooned at Niagara Falls as the first celebrity couple to do so.
Aww.
Or, like, influential couple to do so, before moving to South Carolina, where Joseph entered politics, serving in the legislature for 10 years before being elected as governor. They started off happily but humbly, living with Joseph's brother, before moving into the plantation home his grandfather built when they had finished remodeling it, and Joseph was old enough to claim his inheritance. It was comparable in size to other houses in the area, so it was a very common home, nothing grand or elaborate, and Aaron Burr wrote to Theodosia around this time, saying that he was glad that they weren't starting off in splendor. Apparently, he thought it would be better for her character.
Okay, but he wanted her to marry a rich man.
He wanted her to marry a rich man, but he didn't want her to get spoiled and not, like, maintain the discipline that he instilled in her growing up.
Okay.
He wanted her to work for it and earn it, you know?
You kind of can't have the best of both worlds here, man.
So Joseph's career was going well, and Theodosia traveled to their second home in Charleston, where she enjoyed the social benefits that her plantation home didn't allow, and they were happy and everything was great until it wasn't. So unfortunately, Theodosia's life started becoming destabilized only a year after her marriage. In 1802, Theodosia gave birth to a son, naming him after her father by naming him Aaron Burr Alston. But I have to give a warning for a traumatic birth story here. The baby survives, but if a mother having major medical difficulties is a trigger for you, please skip ahead to the timestamp in the notes of this episode. She does survive this. So in pregnancy or in birth, she suffered from what's called a prolapsed uterus, which is kind of as awful as it sounds. It is when the muscles and the ligaments in your pelvic floor weakened and can't support the uterus, and it slips down into the vagina. Which sounds excruciating and terrifying, but according to Mayo Clinic, it doesn't usually require treatment unless it disrupts your normal day-to-day activities. Disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and this is not medical advice nor a professional opinion of any kind. This is just reporting what Mayo Clinic says to get some insight into Theodosia's story. She must have had a more severe case, though, because her birth story resulted in trauma and sickness that she never fully recovered from. She spent a lot of time traveling to doctors, seeking treatments for infections, illnesses, and pain. She was even bedridden for months at one point after falling and damaging her spine, which was worsened by the condition that she already had. She was only 19 when she had her son and all her medical troubles began.
Oh my goodness. That poor girl.
So, not all her troubles were medical, though. Her father's career was in a decline at this point, and he began selling off his properties, including but not limited to Theodosia's childhood home. Which meant that she no longer had access to it. So not too long afterwards, in 1804, Aaron Burr makes his fatal mistake by not throwing away his shot and shooting Alexander Hamilton, ending Hamilton's life and destroying his own. Theodosia's father, whom she loved so dearly, was wanted for murder.
He kind of messed up a little bit there?
Yeah, a little bit. So, quick side note about the timing of this. When I was looking at the timeline of her life and realized when this event happened, I immediately thought about Aaron Burr's line in the Hamilton song, "The world was wide enough," where he sings, "I had only one thought before the slaughter. This man will not make an orphan of my daughter," and gets emotional. Now, like, they were very close, but she was a married adult and a mother herself even.
Yeah.
And orphans can be any age. The term isn't exclusively referring to children. I'm not disputing that. But the way the line was written had me thinking that she was still a child when that happened. Like, she'd be helpless without Burr there.
Yeah, no, I knew that she was older and married with kids.
See, I had no idea. I thought that she was a child at that point still.
But, I mean, I went through the Hamilton Bible tome, like, thoroughly, and I think that's where I, like, learned it, where I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, like, she's a little old to be, like, that emotional about it. Like, she's perfectly fine. She's taken care of.
Right.
What about your other children?
Right, but they had such a close connection that, like, it still kind of makes sense. But it was, like, that moment that I was like, oh, wait, she wasn't, like, 12 when that happened.
No.
Which, I mean, it makes sense because you see Philip grow up, and so you see the passage of time in the play. I just never put, like, the connection together that, like, these two babies that were born at the same time are obviously both going to be adults by the time this happens. So,
Yeah, but Philip's already gone.
Philip's already gone at that point, I know, but he was an adult when he got into the duel too, right? So, like, clearly Theodosia would have been an adult, but this was, like, my, like, the moment where I suddenly realized, like, oh, wait, she wasn't a little kid there.
No, and she, like, was literally married. Like, if she wasn't married, then I'd be like, yeah, like, be worried about it. But she was married with, like, at least one child.
She was married and she had a child. She only had the one child. She never had another one, I think, with her medical conditions. I don't think it would have been, like, safe for her to do that. Yeah, so, yeah, I was under the impression that she'd be, like, genuinely helpless without Burr there. So, she was very distraught about her father's situation, but her needs were still met as much as could be with her medical conditions, and she wasn't dependent on him by any standards. The line just kind of struck me as odd. Until I found out that the night before the duel, this is the thing that does make it make sense though, he wrote a letter to her husband, more or less begging him to continue encouraging Theodosia's education, apparently still obsessed with making her the smartest in the room, in every room. He really never would be satisfied with how far she'd come, and he wasn't gonna be able to wait for it if he didn't stay alive. You see what I'm doing here? I see your face. Okay. Okay, I'll take a break from the Hamilton references now. Sorry, I can help it one last time. I'm not sorry.
Okay.
Listen, I wrote this part in the middle of the night fueled by caffeine and sugar. Let me live my life.
No.
So, comedic relief aside, we all know by now that Hamilton died. Burr was charged with his murder, and Theodosia was absolutely devastated. He was later vindicated, but Burr's reputation was absolutely demolished, and his career looked like it was over, and his actions brought shame on Theodosia's in-laws just by being connected to him.
Well, I mean, he did, like, shoot and kill a very important person. Like,
yeah, like, yes, yeah.
As we talked about with, like, the Evangeline story, like, the Hamiltons were, like, the creme de la creme of New York society.
So, as you can imagine, she was massively depressed over this, as well as her seemingly incurable health conditions that she was in the middle of fighting over, like, fighting her way through.
Yeah, I relate with her, yeah.
Yeah, I thought about you when I was reading up on that. She wrote a letter to her father saying that she never ended up sending, saying that she felt she was, quote, standing on the brink of eternity. And it was only a few years later that Burr was tried for treason, but no one on the defense or the prosecution could agree as to what actually happened, so he was acquitted as there wasn't enough evidence of anything. Burr did, however, jump bail and flee to Europe in 1808, which left Theodosia to miss him desperately.
Yeah, that doesn't make anybody think that you're not guilty or anything if you're like, oh shoot, I'm on bail. I'm just going to flee to the other side of the friggin' world.
I'm just gonna go. I'm just gonna get out of here. So he jumped bail. He was wanted for that. He realized as well that his reputation was bringing down his daughter's, like, standings, because it was bringing down her husband's, like, reputation and, like, his side of the family, and, like, he needed her to have them in a good position so that like she would be doing like better. So he's just like, you know what, I'm gonna just peace out of here. I'm just like
Yes,
gone.
but jumping ship and not taking the consequences isn't gonna help your situation.
I know that, and you know that. But that's what he did. And like I said, she missed him. She missed him so much so that she wrote to the then First Lady, Madame Dolly Madison, making a case to her to, quote, apply to the president for a removal of the prosecution now existing against Aaron Burr, end quote, arguing that he had already lost everything, and even if he did have plans for treason, there was no way he'd be able to carry it out now because he had lost all of his friends and all of his influence and all of his resources.
Doesn't mean that there's not a one-man show treason happening.
The treason that they were suggesting was that he was trying to branch off a portion of America and like United States and Mexico and like make an empire of his own, which he would be emperor over. And it's like a whole theory that we don't know how much of it is true.
Yeah, the guy who just hangs out in the sidelines is totally now all of a sudden like, let me become emperor.
Well, people theorize that that's why he educated Theodosia the way that she was educated, was so that she could be empress when he was gone, because she would be the only blood heir that he acknowledged at that point, right? So like the theory doesn't have no grounds, but it has very few grounds.
I would still say that there's like no grounds.
It's an interesting theory, and if you've got the time, I do like, it's interesting to look into. I don't know how much of it is actually accurate and how much of it was just political like vitriol spread at him because people hated him at this point.
Well, yeah, he killed friggin' Alexander Hamilton.
Listen, I know.
The musical's not named Aaron Burr.
I know. So, like, it's possible that it's slander. We don't know, but it is an interesting theory. So she argues that there's no way he'd be able to carry it out now. She also argues that he sacrificed a lot for the country, for the foundation of the country, and that it was an injustice that he should be in exile, self-inflicted exile, but exile nonetheless, instead of retiring despite being, quote, one of the first characters the United States ever produced. She ends off by saying that she didn't tell her husband that she was writing this letter, and I have a big long quote here, so bear with me. If it be an error, attribute it to the indiscreet zeal of a daughter whose soul sinks at the gloomy prospect of a long and indefinite separation from a father almost adored, and who can leave unattempted nothing which offers the slightest hope of procuring him redress. What indeed would I not risk once more to see him, to hang upon him, to place my child on his knee, and again spend my days in the happy occupation of endeavoring to anticipate all his wishes. Because everything about Theodosia is just so intense.
But poor Burr when she says, almost.
Almost, I know, almost adored.
Like, he keeps having, like, these almost moments.
Yeah.
Except for killing Hamilton. That was like the one thing that he didn't almost do. He actually did.
Right? She clearly adores him. Like, she's literally saying here that she's willing to risk it all just to see her dad one more time. Like, so she clearly adores him. But I got caught at the almost word too. I was like, girl, if this is almost, what is fully? Because
right?
Like, she literally, her last line here is literally, and again spend my days in the happy occupation of endeavoring to anticipate all his wishes. She lives to serve this man. Like, what is fully? How is this almost?
I don't know, but yeah, like, I feel bad for Burr that it's literally an almost adore. Like, he's like pretty much, he's like to us it's a fully adore, but it's still just an almost.
Right? She still had to throw that almost in there. Oh man.
He just can't win.
So her husband's career was still successful, at least, but her son was really the gem of her life. Briefly, in 1810, she was encouraged by a doctor she had met, and she wrote that she was certain this doctor would restore her health and she'd be overjoyed when she could hold her then 8-year-old son again. Her husband had purchased a large chunk of land that they lived in during the summer. But in 1812, when they were like out visiting, he had to return to his father's summer home in Debedew. I think that's how you say that. I'm not sure. In order to start campaigning for an upcoming election. They had summer homes specifically to avoid contracting malaria, though it didn't have that name yet, as most rice plantation owners did, because it was a big problem on rice plantations during the summer, that there would be all these mosquitoes and it would be spreading malaria around. So Alston took his wife and son with him to the Debedew, it was another summer home. But while they were there, Aaron Burr Alston, Theodosia's only child, contracted malaria and passed away at only 10 years old.
So, like, in the summer home that you're supposed to not be able to contract malaria from, the kid contracts malaria.
Yeah, yes.
The poor woman.
Right?
Like, we're gonna do what we can so that we don't contract it, and oh shit.
And the poor dad, too, to, like, be the one, like, they were at another summer home where they were seemingly safe, and they only traveled to the one where the kid got sick because of his job. So it was literally just because of him that they went there in the first place, like, the survivor's guilt, like,
yeah.
Ooh. So he was only 10 years old, which happened to be the same age Theodosia was when she lost her mother, which is just, like, a connection that's just, like it just hurts to think about.
Yeah.
So her father was still in exile through all of this. Her health worsened, as did her depression, for all the obvious reasons. Her grief was heavy. She wrote that, quote, "The world is blank. I have lost my boy. My child is gone forever," in talking about this time.
Yeah, and, like, knowing with, like, chronic illnesses and stuff, like, stress and grief does not help whatsoever. No. So, like, it's just, like, a vicious cycle for her, like, and especially at a time when there's no help for her, really.
And she was sunk in it. She was lost in it. But she did finally have a glimmer of hope when her father told her he was returning to New York soon afterwards, finally coming back across the ocean. She desperately wanted to see him again, but this is 1812, and there's a war going on.
Yeah.
Joseph hesitated, but they decided that she alone would go by ship. They figured that would be safer. So most of the usual ships had been taken over by the Navy, and only a few smaller ships were around, and even fewer would be carrying passengers. So it took them a while, but they found a ship called the Patriot, whose captain was willing to sail her. Her husband traveled with her to the harbor at Georgetown in South Carolina and said goodbye to her unknowingly for the last time. December 30th, 1812, the Patriot left the harbor, crossed the bar into open sea, and no one on the ship was ever seen again. 2 months later, Alston wrote a letter to Burr saying, "This, then, is the end of all the hopes we had formed." So, remember, she was not only Alston's wife and Burr's daughter, she was also proof of the capabilities of all womankind and was meant to be a beacon and an example for all women. And she died young before, to their eyes, she could fully realize that.
Yeah. Well, and, like, if... I feel bad because I'm like, okay, so, like, Burr was supposed to have come to New York, and then they're like, oh, no, we'll just send you and, like, send her instead.
No. She was going by boat to New York.
Oh, where were they then? Like,
so they were in Georgetown, which is in South Carolina, and so they
why
thought
wouldn't you just
that
travel?
Her safest.
Oh, because I guess because of the war that you're not going to travel through the actual states.
So because of the war,
so you're just going to do like a round trip.
Exactly. So because of everything else that was going on, they decided that the safest form of travel would be by ship, but even that was dangerous because there was the British Navy to consider and all, like, the fighting happening on the sea. So they finally found a ship. They thought it was going to be safe. She had this glimmer of hope. She had been in this depression. She was sick for so long. She had just lost her child. She has this glimmer of hope. She's finally going to get to see her father again, and she never makes it there.
Yeah.
What a tragic ending. It's just all these circumstances added up at the worst time in the worst way.
Mm-hmm.
So,
although really, why would you want to go to New York? It's a little close to Washington, D.C., where we are burning down the White House.
I think it was because, like, she wouldn't, there was a reason that Burr wouldn't have been able to make it out to her, but if she went to New York, she could see him. I can't remember exactly
don't go to New York, just go straight down to where your kid is.
I know, I know, but like, I can't remember what it was now, but I remember that there was a reason that like he couldn't he couldn't come to see her. It might have had to do with his court cases, like, because yeah, so he had a lot of stuff like legally going on. So I don't know if he would have been like allowed to go down to see her, but if she came up to New York, she could see him. So that was like, she's like, this is the only way I can see you, so we're gonna make this happen. Scary times, scary things are happening, but we're gonna make this work.
Yeah, but dude, at this time, as we know, no identification is needed. Put on a disguise, just get on a ship, and just bypass New York.
I mean, clearly he's okay with breaking the law, so like...
Exactly! So, why, like, there's no reason for you not to just go straight to your child if she's not New York.
There was some reason, I can't remember what it was, but there was some reason that it was just, it made more sense. Like, I mean, they had no way of knowing, though, right? Like, they had no way of knowing. Like, they knew it wasn't going to be, like, safe either way, but they had no way of knowing.
Instead of sending a woman through a war zone, send the father!
He would too, though, and he's, like, a much more, like, noted political figure. He would have been a bigger target, but...
That's the risk you take.
They thought that she would have been the safer of the three of them. They thought that she would have been the safest one to travel. She's the less, like, she's the most inconspicuous, you know?
Sure. We'll go with that. They were clearly wrong.
So.
History does have their eyes on you guys. You were wrong.
Oh, man. So Austen died only a few years later in 1816, but Burr survived her for much longer until 1836. So, what happened to Theodosia? There are a few theories. I've got about 4 of them listed, and I came up with number 5 when you mentioned the thing about pirates earlier. But that's just mine and is based on nothing historically. It's just a fun one, so I'm going to mention it in a minute. But first, the most, like, according to historians, the more likely theories. So number 1, the admiral of the British fleet reported that there was a massive storm with hurricane-like winds that swept over the path of the Patriot. According to the admiral, there was no way a small ship like the Patriot could survive the storm. Aaron Burr was eventually convinced that the ship was simply wrecked in the storm, and she and the rest of the passengers didn't survive. So this was the, like, kind of winning theory when it happened.
Okay.
However, within 10 years, stories of deathbed confessions from former pirates started surfacing. Pirates began claiming that they were involved in the disappearance of the Patriot, but their stories didn't line up with what they did know, and most of them were quickly disproven. There were 2, however, that said they were part of the crew on the Patriot, and they had mutinied, taking off with the loot from the ship on a smaller ship, leaving the Patriot to drift or sink in their wake. They never mentioned the storm, though it's unknown if they were telling the truth.
Okay,
no,
but
hang on,
what
I
was
skipped a word there.
Like, what was the Patriot then? Like, what type of ship was it that
It was essentially a dinghy. Like, it wasn't like a very big ship at the time.
But then what kind of loot were they taking?
Excellent question. Anyway, just whatever. There was, like, I mean, they were hauling around Theodosia Burr. Like, she was a wealthy woman.
So what,
like, her husband was extremely
their loot
successful.
was Theodosia? Like...
Not Theodosia, but her stuff. Fancy dresses. We'll get into some of the stuff that they did find from the ship later. Well, potentially. Yeah, so they never mentioned the storm, though, so it's unknown if they were telling the truth. Essentially, these pirates are believed to be clout chasing by trying to claim responsibility for the mysterious disappearance of the Patriot and getting away with it, but then again, sometimes this truth is stranger than fiction, so who really knows? It could have been pirates. We don't know. Hard to tell. Pirates are known for tall tales. So, theory number 3 is years later, after Theodosia's disappearance, a portrait called The Nag's Head was pulled out of the attic of a woman who had a very peculiar story about how she came to own it. Dr. William Poole was on vacation in Nag's Head, where he was called to the bedside of a woman named Polly Mann, the widow of a local fisherman. He noticed the portrait in her home and asked the woman where she got it. She lived in a small, humble home, so the portrait of a young, aristocratic woman caught his attention. Mrs. Mann told him that when she was young, during the war with the British, a ship washed ashore with no one inside. Now, in that area, a lot of locals were poor and desperate and had no problem looting shipwrecked ships to take and sell or use whatever they could. So, some wreckers found this completely abandoned ship and got to work looting it. One of the wreckers was Mann's lover at the time, and he earned himself 2 black silk dresses and the portrait that day and gave them to Mann as a gift. Dr. Poole then made a deal with Mann that rather than paying him for his services, she could simply exchange the portrait for his assistance. She agreed, and Dr. Poole took it home with him to research it thoroughly. His research convinced him that the portrait was an image of Theodosia Burr. He did everything he could to authenticate it, even finding Burr's descendants and members of Alston's family to ask them to confirm it. Burr's descendants were convinced, but the Alston side was less convinced. One member of the family was still alive who had known Theodosia, and she couldn't say for sure, as she was only 9 when Theodosia disappeared and was now in her 60s. But she said that the eyes were her likeness. Further, the timing of Mann's story matches up with the timing of the Patriot's disappearance, and the Patriot was the only civilian ship recorded as being lost in January 1813.
Okay.
So, since its discovery, no one has ever come forward saying that this portrait was an image of anyone else. And considering this portrait is one of the more common images of Theodosia appearing in all sorts of publications, there's been plenty of opportunity for it to be recognized. If you compare it to other confirmed images of Theodosia, you can see the similarities for yourself. The portrait isn't dated or signed, so we'll likely never know who actually painted it. But personally, I'm pretty well convinced that it's her. Whether or not it was actually found on the ship or just a convincing interpretation of what she would have looked like is another question.
I mean, it's possible because like ships running ashore and being found empty is common, like when you look at like the Bermuda Triangle and stuff. So, and then like during one of the documentaries that I saw on like the Bermuda Triangle, it was like they're saying that with storms, which apparently happened around this time of the sailing, that the ships can get kind of like lost at sea. Then they're going around and around, and if you start running out of like water and stuff and you start drinking sea, like the salty water, that can actually start to have massive repercussions, and then people will start dripping off the ship and stuff like that, or just passing away. So it's like it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility that like that the ship like kind of like came ashore and wrecked on the shore, so then all these goods and stuff were still fairly salvageable.
So here's theory number 4, and this is kind of the one that I lean towards, which suggests that the events of theory number 3 were not a coincidence. So theory number 4 is a slight variation to theory number 3. So Mrs. Mann wasn't particularly forthcoming with her story about the wreckers, and Dr. Poole always said that he felt that she was hiding something when she was telling her story, which leads to a theory that has to do with the state in which the ship was found. We've already talked about how people in the area made money as wreckers, taking scrap and loot from wrecked ships. That's confirmed. We know that they did that. Supposedly, some of the wreckers in the area were also okay with, shall we say, fabricating shipwrecks.
So pirate shipwreckers?
Land pirates is what they call them. So, story goes that land pirates would tie a lantern to the neck or head of a nag, that is an old horse, hence nag's head, and walk them up and down the rocky coast at night in order to trick ships into thinking that they were sailing into a safe harbor. Then, because it would look like a lighthouse. And then, when the ships ran aground or into the rocks, they would kill everyone on the ship and loot it. And that's where the area gets the name Nag's Head from. So...
But then where are the bodies?
Probably tossed back into the sea, I would imagine. And also, the portrait was found like years and years and years, like ages after the shipwreck actually took place. So they would be long gone.
But like we all know like that body parts will wash up somewhere.
Somewhere. Possibly connected to something, possibly eaten by a shark, possibly completely unidentifiable, especially in the 1800s, where they didn't have DNA technology.
I mean, true, but like...
Eaten by the fishes, buried in the bush, buried on the beach. Who knows? It's a mystery. Clearly they did something, because they gone.
But you'd think that, like, Theodosia with, like, her brains...
But she was also very, very sick, remember?
True.
And she was traveling at sea, so she could not have been well.
Yeah. I mean, nobody's well at that point traveling by sea. You don't have gravel.
Exactly. And Brain is not Braun, and also she was not the she was a passenger on the ship. It's not like she was the one personally that was tricked. It would have been
True.
the captain and his crew. And in a stormy, we know it was stormy at that time, right? So in a stormy night, they're looking for a safe harbor, possibly to wait out the storm. They see a lantern in the distance. They think it's a safe harbor. It makes sense.
No, it does.
So the question here becomes, was the ship really empty when it was discovered, or did land pirates trick it into crashing onto the shoals and kill everyone on board? Or did sea pirates attack the ship, kill everyone on board, and realize the British ships were too close and abandon the ship without looting it, leaving it to wash ashore abandoned like Mrs. Mann claimed? Or were they just lost at sea and the ship washed up after everybody passed away from, like, being dehydrated and sick and everything?
Yeah. I mean,
So
there's too many options.
there's too many options. There's too many things. It's either it did actually wash up on shore empty and everyone was already dead, or her lover at the time, who wasn't the man that she ended up marrying, was a land pirate and stole a portrait and 2 black silk dresses from Theodosia to give to her.
I mean, if you find finders keepers, but
Finders keepers. My 5th option, as soon as you mentioned about Theodosia turning to piracy, I immediately thought that oh wait, what if they were taken by pirates? And because we talked about with Anne Bonny that it was common practice that if they took a ship, they would just kidnap the people on board and take them with them. So it's, what if she was taken by pirates? What if she did join them and we just she changed her name or something and just was never caught?
I don't know, because I think
who knows?
I'm not so sure though now, knowing that she was sick, so sick, and that she was so dedicated to Aaron Burr that she would have been like, I need to go see my father. She would have found a way to go see Aaron, no matter what.
Yeah.
It would be like a Bonnie and Clyde kind of a thing, that I want to go see my parent. Yes, I'm a pirate now, but I need to go say hello.
No, you're totally right. I like the imagery of Theodosia, the charming intellectual, joining the band of pirates as a means of escaping in order to get back to her father, which she was never able to do. But realistically...
no. She'd probably, sadly, died at sea.
Yeah, more likely that she was killed by them, unfortunately. So, and the part of the thing going towards the portrait, most likely being Theodosia's as well, that it's been theorized that since she hadn't seen her father for so long, since they were so close, since he was finally coming back to America and was kind of starting over, a portrait of herself to give to her father would have made for a fantastic welcome back gift.
Yeah.
And so people think that that's why she had a portrait of herself with her.
No, it definitely would make sense.
I agree. But no one will ever know for sure. Since her disappearance, Theodosia has been the subject of historical novels, plays, movies, even local ghost stories. So, one story claims that Theodosia's ghost can be found in the cemetery where her husband and son were buried, weeping and mourning their deaths. The other is that she haunts the beach near her father-in-law's beach house where her son died. Some of the foundation from that house is still there, which ties her there, according to the legend.
Let's go ghost hunting. I will figure it out. I will find out if Theodosia's there.
We'll go. I did think about the cemetery thing, and I'm okay, but the odds that someone is crying at a cemetery at any given time, I feel if you're gonna hear weeping that you can't quite place, it's probably just someone else actually mourning their loved one.
Unless it's they can hear it specifically at those grave sites.
I don't know, it's just local legend.
It could be any widow or whatever, ghost.
Exactly. No, but it's just local legend. But yeah, that is the life and mysterious disappearance of Theodosia Burr. Thoughts, comments, questions?
I mean, I just feel for her. Knowing what she was going through with, her pains and stuff, I super feel for that poor woman. And then, with all of the grief and stuff that was happening around the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, she went through a lot. She really went through it. The pressure that she was under, literally from being an infant to being an adult, is intense. I can't imagine being raised specifically to be the feminist, like, torchbearer for all women everywhere. Like, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a lot.
No, it's definitely a lot. And then I'm also like I'm wondering like how her final moments like were for her because like with like I really liked how with like Hamilton how Lynn looked at it like that he was maybe looking and going there's my son, there's George Washington, like I can like if I do die at least I can be with them. That like in
Yeah.
that situation for her was there that piece that I'm gonna see my son and my
And her
mom and
mother.
stuff like that again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like I'm hoping that like her final moments were somewhat peaceful, like in a way for her. Like I'm
Yeah.
gonna bet that they're not that definitely they weren't fun.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't like she was just passing away in her sleep most likely.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping
It's
there's some peace that she had of hey, I'm gonna go see my family again.
girl went through so much trauma, and she went through so much of it with such grace and ease. Like, well, maybe not ease, maybe ease isn't the right word, but she was able to present herself. Like, she was like
Mm-hmm.
so high functioning throughout so much of it, and it wasn't until she was like physically ill that anything stopped her.
Yeah.
Like, just the pressure that she grew up under, losing her mother at such a young age, like having that kind of like instability of her father being sometimes there and sometimes gone, like, and then to like still be able to carry that charisma and that charm and to be able to like convince everyone, like
Right?
everyone, that
Yeah.
she was this delightful prodigy is, and to be like, that was kind of the height of her life, was like just before she got married, and then like I guess later, like the good times with her son when she did have them. Like, it's just, yeah, she went through a lot.
No. She definitely went through a lot.
Yeah, another lighthearted episode.
Well, I mean, yeah, like as everybody knows, that's just kind of our thing.
No, I do find some hope in it though. Like, throughout all of it, she was still, for the most part, there were definitely times where like her depression got the better of her. We definitely saw examples of that, but she looked for the hope.
Yeah.
You know, like she like made a best friend for life when like shortly after her mother passed away. She like, you know, carried everything that her father placed on her. She like, you know, she was convinced into marrying a guy that she ended up really liking, and they actually seemed very happy with each other.
Yeah,
um
right?
I didn't find any sources of him cheating, so like
Fingers crossed.
fingers crossed, knock on wood. As far as we know.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, geez, but he seemed like he was clearly madly in love with her, and like, yeah, like she definitely like had her bright and shining moments, but like to finally be able to see her father again, who she so dearly missed, and then to just not quite make it and to disappear in such like a, like, you know, we have no idea why it happened or how it happened or like what happened.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, I, and for her husband, he didn't live very long after that, but to have that unanswered question of like what happened to her would have been, and like after he lost his son too, right? So like
Well, and
that,
like for Burr as well, like not knowing what happened as well,
yeah.
right?
For Burr not knowing what happened, why did she never show up? For the husband, like he lost his son, and then very shortly after he lost his wife, it didn't really surprise me to read that only a few years after that he himself passed away.
Yeah.
From illness, I believe. Like, I don't think it was self-inflicted or anything, but like that takes a toll on you.
Oh, totally.
So, but yeah, I guess my hopeful note was that like she proved Burr right. His
Yeah.
theory about like women being able to achieve things as great as what a man could do if given the same opportunity was correct. Like, she did grow up to be this intellectual, this prodigy that everyone talked about. Like, it was short-lived, but he was right.
Yeah, no, he was definitely right. And then nobody paid that much attention to it, I don't think, in history for quite a while.
Well, and see, this is an interesting point, is that we give so much more attention to her mysterious disappearance than to like who she was as a person. So all the work that Burr put into her, all the work that she put into her education is like kind of overshadowed by her mysterious shipwreck.
Yeah.
I mean, what else do we like expect from this society? But at the same time, it's like, oh, come on. Like,
Right?
she worked so hard.
Yeah.
But yeah, I found some images that we'll put up on the Instagram too of like golden age cinema starlets like portraying Theodosia Burr and things like that as well. So they're interesting to look at and look into. If anyone's interested, follow the Instagram and you will see them there.
Yay! Pretty pictures.
Oh, one other, yeah. I mean, we'll talk about it there. But one other cute thing that I wanted to mention, Aaron Burr carried on his person a watch that had miniature portraits of Theodosia, his wife, and also Theodosia, his child, like facing each other on the watch. And it's like the most adorable thing that he would like carry this thing around with him. And we have pictures of it. It is being held in a museum somewhere. I'll put more details on the Instagram, but I'm definitely putting that one on the Instagram too. So stay tuned for that because it's like, it's just really cute. It's just a really cute thing.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a sweet memento.
So yeah, that's Theodosia and Theodosia.
The two Theodosias.
The two Theodosias. All right. So do we know, or we do know what our next episode is?
Yeah, next episode is Lady Poisoners and the Angel of Death phenomenon.
Yes. Super light topics. Come prepared.
Yeah.
But it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely interesting stuff. Like, I'm hoping that there's not gonna be like a super, super long episode.
No, we can keep it short. We can keep it light as we can.
Yeah, but...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah. All right. So we'll see you guys next time on the darker side of history.